In the dark streets of Yorkshire, an unassuming lorry driver hid a chilling secret. Born into violence and driven by a sinister obsession, Peter Sutcliffe would become one of the most feared killers in England's history. But was he a product of a broken childhood or something far darker? This is the haunting story of the Yorkshire Ripper, his victims, his twisted mind, and the moral lesson behind the terror. Stay tuned for a tale that questions the very nature of evil. John William Sutcliffe was born in 1922, and he was 3 years younger than his wife, Kathleen Frances. Their son, Peter William Sutcliffe, was born on the 2nd of June in 1946 at their Bradford hometown of Bingley. Peter was the oldest of 5 siblings and lived with the rest of his family in a 4-bedroom house. Kathleen was a native of Ireland and a Catholic Christian. She raised her children in her faith, and at some point in his life, he was an altar boy. However, John, his father, was a violent drunkard, and their marriage was troubled. Sutcliffe's early childhood was also plagued with misery. As young as 5 years old, John smashed a bottle over his head at Christmas because he sat in his seat. John abused his wife and Sutcliffe, and his siblings witnessed so much violence and anger. It's believed Sutcliffe, a premature baby, resulted from the abuse his mother suffered when she was pregnant with him. John was a known womanizer, and sadly Sutcliffe would take over his father's violence and addiction. Sutcliffe was described as a loner. He left school at 15 years and began a voyeuristic lifestyle, whereby he would spy on sex workers. He worked several odd jobs and eventually becomes a lorry driver for a tire firm where he's fired for stealing. He finds another job with another firm as a lorry driver. He was known to solicit prostitutes. Peter was married to schoolteacher Sonia Surma, a Czechoslovakian, in 1974 after courting her for 7 years. Unfortunately, after a series of miscarriages, Sonia was barren. Sutcliffe moved to Heaton, Bradford with his wife in 1977, where he lived until his capture in 1981. His victims were all females and mostly prostitutes ranging from ages 16 to 47 years old. His spree was concentrated to the northern west regions of England, including the Yorkshire and Greater Manchester areas. Sutcliffe killed and mutilated his victims, earning him the name the Yorkshire Ripper. Sutcliffe claimed God told him to kill prostitutes. He was known to have attacked a prostitute in 1969 by hitting her over the head with a rock and a sock, who survived. The story was he was conned by another prostitute, and when he went looking for her, he came across his victim, who he followed into a garage. Sutcliffe had been with his friend Trevor and told him he just struck a woman over the head. He told his friend to drive off. However, their license plate had been noted down, which was how they were able to trace them. Sutcliffe admitted to the police he'd struck her with his fist, and he then got back into his car and drove off. The victim had reported the issue to the police, however, didn't press charges. She was known to be a prostitute. It's believed Trevor, his friend, had been the one to report his suspicion Sutcliffe was the killer to the police later on. Sutcliffe attacked at least 3 more women who he struck over the head with a hammer and finished off with slashing them across the stomach or buttock. However, they all survived. The first murder he would be convicted of would be that of Wilma McCann. Wilma was a prostitute in the Chapeltown area in Leeds, Yorkshire, with her 4 children. In 1975, Sutcliffe hit her on the head 5 times and then stabbed her in the neck, chest, and abdomen. 42-year-old Emily Jackson was a prostitute working in Leeds. In 1976, Sutcliffe had trapped her in the van she worked out of and stabbed her 51 times with a sharpened screwdriver in the neck, chest, and abdomen. Before he left, he stamped an impression of his boot print into her thigh. That same year, he attacked another young woman, Marcella, who was 20 years old and 4 months pregnant at the time. He hit her on the head when she accepted a lift from Sutcliffe on her way home from a party. She miscarried. Marcella would testify against him in court. Sutcliffe went on to attack 9 more women, most of whom would die. He used the same MO. By now, it was long ago the police would have the profile of their suspect. They initially thought the victims were all prostitutes. However, when some of them turned out to be decent, normal women living honest lives, this sent panic throughout the northern region. In November of 1979/1978, Sutcliffe's mother died of a heart attack. This may have been the reason behind the hiatus in his killing spree, which began again about 12 months later. On the 4th of April, 1979, Sutcliffe attacked 19-year-old Josephine, a bank clerk who was going home from work. At this point, they received a tape with a man's voice claiming to be the serial killer. The voice taunted the police working on the case. It was the accent of the man's voice that led them to believe they were looking for a man with a Wearside accent, which comes from the Castletown area of Sunderland. The killer at the time was named Wearside Jack. Unbeknownst to them, Wearside Jack was actually a hoaxer. He also wrote letters of his crimes to the police, signing his letters as Jack the Ripper. Another young woman, 20-year-old student Barbara, is attacked by Sutcliffe and dies. At this point, the police have brought him in for questioning about 9 times, but they can't arrest him. The police had in fact caught up with Sutcliffe. However, due to insufficient evidence, he was always let go because they couldn't completely match him to their profile based largely on tips. One of such tips was that from Wearside Jack, who had a strong Sunderland accent. However, Sutcliffe had a Yorkshire accent and couldn't have been responsible for the taunting letters and confession tapes. John Humble confessed to being the killer, and to this day, it's not clear why he did this. This severely impacted their investigation, causing the police force to invest valuable time and resource into a false lead. Also, it facilitated Sutcliffe's further killings of 3 mother women. When he was caught, Humble was found to be an unemployed alcoholic from Sunderland, and in 2005, he was charged and sentenced with perverting the course of justice. He dies in 2019. In 1980, Sutcliffe is caught drinking under influence, but he is let go on bail. Sutcliffe attacks 5 women, 2 of whom died. In November, a colleague of his reports his suspicions to the police that Sutcliffe is the perpetrator. However, this is never acted upon. He was suspected of committing as much as 13 other offenses, including a further 2 in European country of Sweden, which he wasn't convicted of due to a lack of evidence. In the days prostitution was legal, some southern Swedish towns was home to the red light district. One of such southern areas was the town of Exercisegatan. Here is where 26-year-old Teresa would cross paths with Sutcliffe and meet her ill-fated end. On the 30th of August, 1980, she was witnessed by other workers on the strip leaving with a client, and that was the last anyone saw or heard from her. She is found 2 days later in the stairwell of a dilapidated abandoned building, covered by a carpet. She was found by a vagrant collecting bottles. At the scene, it could be immediately observed she'd been sodomized, evidenced by the stick which was sticking out from her bottom. A post-mortem examination of her corpse revealed she was murdered the same night she was thought to have gone missing. There was evidence of blunt force trauma from being hit on the head by a blunt object. Bruising and ligature marks on her neck led to the fact she was killed by strangulation. She also tested positive for Class A drugs. The examination suggested she wasn't raped vaginally, but there was a substance like semen on her body. The telltale sign of a necrophiliac murder. Sweden was new to murders of this kind, and their detectives were able to link it to another murder, which had occurred only a few weeks before. On August 12th, in the Swedish town of Gothenburg, the body of 31-year-old Gertie is found naked on a demolition site. Her head had been caved in by a brick. The police had received several reports of surrounding these 2 murders on the days they were thought to have gone missing. However, none of these tips led anywhere. Without any more clues for obvious reasons, the trail goes cold. As a lorry driver, Sutcliffe would have traveled the ferry during this period, which coincides with the times of death of the 2 Swedish women. The 70s and 80s was a time of misogynism and sexism, even in the more developed West. Female professionals at this time recall the contempt for women displayed by the force's choice of an all-male team deployed to work the case of the Yorkshire Ripper. It was considered the police had refused to take the matter more seriously due to the fact the victims were all females in the sex trade, and attributed this to the reason why some cases were never pursued in line with the investigation if they fell out of the criteria, as in the case of 14-year-old Tracy, who was a schoolgirl. Sutcliffe would later admit to this crime before the police would accept Tracy's report of a hammer-wielding attacker was indeed Sutcliffe. Another survivor was 16-year-old Teresa, who was hit over the head by hammer-wielding Sutcliffe. The blows were powerful enough to leave her with permanent brain damage. Fortunately for her, her boyfriend rushed to the scene, hearing her cries. The detectives believed those who didn't match the profile of his victims were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The then Prime Minister, Thatcher, at the time was shown to have become increasingly agitated at the length of time taken to capture the killer. In January 1981, Sutcliffe was driving a brown Rover and had stopped somewhere after picking up a prostitute. The police had driven by his car and approached him. They ran his license plates and found they were fake. When they searched his boot, they found tools of his trade, including a screwdriver and hammer, and he was arrested. When he was arrested and taken to the police station, on getting there, he excused himself to use the toilet where he hid a knife which was on his person in the toilet. When the police searched him, they found he wore a V-neck sweater under his clothes. The reason they suggest is to protect his knees when he knelt over his victims from the padded elbows, and the V-neck area was to expose his genitals. After being apprehended, Sutcliffe admits to being the killer. During interrogation, this is when he claimed God had told him to kill. Sutcliffe pleaded not guilty to 13 counts of murder. He felt he was guilty of manslaughter on ground of diminished capacity. In February 1981, at the Dewsbury Magistrates Court, Sutcliffe is charged with 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He's sentenced to HMP Parkhurst to serve his sentence. At this point, the interest was again rekindled with the Swedish detectives, and they reached out to the British law enforcement, inquiring as to whether their British Sutcliffe had visited the country of Sweden in 1980. They receive a response in the negative, advising he only traveled to European countries Czech and Paris in 1971 and 1974 to visit family and on his honeymoon. There was no further investigation. After Sutcliffe's capture, the police continued to investigate several other cold cases which he could have committed. This was called Operation Painthole. In August 2016, the police in England had reached out to the Swedish police, stating there could be a link between their murders and those committed by Sutcliffe, who by now had been behind bars for nearly 30 years. Unfortunately, and sadly for their families, due to Swedish laws, the case was statute barred, and there was no further progress to be made on these cold cases. At the time, the new detective in charge made a case in favor of testing DNA collected at the time of the 1980 killings, as a serial killer likely went on to kill more, and is a good enough reason to solve these cases regardless of if the perpetrator would be convicted or not. At the end of Operation Painthole, it's believed Sutcliffe was responsible for up to 23 more deaths, including a man. Sutcliffe spent 30 years at Broadmoor Hospital due to a diagnosis of mental disorder. He was then transferred to HMP Franklin in County Durham 2016. While in prison, he changes his surname to Coonan, his mother's maiden name. Whilst incarcerated, he's attacked on a number of occasions by his fellow inmates, sustaining injuries to the face with a broken bottle. He's subjected to strangulation. He's also stabbed in the eye with a pen, causing him to completely lose his eye. And on another occasion, he's stabbed in his other cheek when an inmate aimed for his remaining good eye with a blade. He also developed diabetes whilst in prison. In 2004, his father dies at the age of 81 years. In 2010, Sutcliffe appealed to overturn the court's order of a life sentence, but this was rejected. Sutcliffe was transported to the University Hospital of North Durham, where he died from COVID complications on the 13th of November in 2020 at the age of 74. No one from his family attended his funeral, showing how saddened they were knowing what crimes their older brother, whom they all looked up to, had done.